Welcome to another Sunday Superversive live stream. This week we are doing a great man stream for Cortés and Cromwell, two Christian men of history. Anthony will be presenting for Cortés, and I will be presenting for Cromwell. But before that, how are you doing today, Anthony?
Wonderful. We had turkey on Thanksgiving and I hate turkey. So I made duck on Black Friday and it was delicious.
Amazing. I also made turkey breast, and it was absolutely fantastic. Turns out bacon wrapping anything can really,
Ooh,
help flavors. Thick
interesting.
cut, and these sort of decisions are what make, Christian men really what they are. The cooking. Oh, no, wait, it's nothing to do with that at all. It's in fact about their faith and their determination to do great
Oh,
deeds in the name of God. In which case, Anthony, we have two special men. You are going first on this one, so why don't you introduce us to Cortez?
okay. So Hernan Cortez. He is the based conquistador who conquered Mexico from the Aztecs specifically. So Cortez is a guy who I'd kind of slept on. You know him from history class. He's kind of normally mentioned somewhat in passing as he was the head of the conquistadors that conquered the Aztec Empire. That's more or less how I knew him. If I were liable to talk about him, I would point out that the Aztecs were despised by all and sundry and that Cortez was a hero. Then I looked into him more and I realized I was sleeping on this guy because he's actually really interesting and really awesome. Uh, like I would not consider Cortez a saint. I would consider him a great man. Saints and great men are not a one-to-one overlap. There is a lot of overlap, but you could be a saint without being a great man, and you could be a great man without being a saint. For example, I would not consider, let's say, Maximilian Kolbe, who is the man who died in the Holocaust and gave his life for a fellow prisoner. The fellow prisoner was going to be killed, and Maximilian Kolbe offered to stand in for him when the man cried about his wife and family, and then Saint Kolbe was tortured to death. Uh, Kolbe is very definitely a saint. He is very definitely a very great saint. I would not consider him a great man. Conversely, I think that Cortez is very definitely a great man, much like Hannibal was very definitely a great man. I would consider neither of these men saints. So there is overlap, but it's not one to one. And if you want somebody, by the way, who is both, I would say St. Louis is in that category. Uh,
Oh, yes.
right, the great St. Louis is in that category. Charlemagne is a blessed. He is close to that category. He is technically not a saint. Uh, but I would put him pretty close to that category because Charlemagne, once he established safety for the Holy See, and converted Europe to Christianity, he stopped his conquering and dedicated his life to the buildup of learning and faith. So I would put him on that list of both. But Cortez is one and not the other, and I'll explain what I mean. And it's not that I think that Cortez was a bad man either. I do not. Uh, but you'll see what I mean. So let's go to first slide early life. So Cortez was born in Spain. His father was an infantry captain. Cortez was of minor nobility, but he was not rich. When he was young, he studied law, which helped him much in his conquest of Mexico. This probably actually contributed a lot more to his life than is often given credit for, because one thing that I talk about later is that Cortez is a man who rolled nat 20 on charisma. He could talk anyone into anything. He was a brilliant motivator of men. And if there is one main skill that consistently pops up with Cortez, it is that. And I think that the studying of law in his youth probably helped a lot with that. He's very good at arguing. He left for Hispaniola, which is the Dominican Republic in Haiti, when he was 18 years old. I'm skipping a lot of like the specific details of his early life because this isn't the interesting part of Cortez's life, but he has some success in the New World. He participates in some of the conquests of Cuba and Hispaniola. He eventually marries the sister of Velasquez, the governor of Cuba, who does not particularly like Cortés. So, great men with great flaws. If Hernan Cortés has a great flaw, one of his flaws is he is something of a womanizer. This is a consistent theme throughout his life. I don't mention it on the slide specifically, but Hernan Cortés is known for this even when he is very young. Supposedly, he would have left for Hispaniola even sooner, but he was injured escaping from the apartment of a married woman. I did not get a source for this, but I saw it mentioned, so at the very least, this is in his reputation. When he marries Velasquez, or the sister of Velasquez, uh, when he marries Velasquez's sister, it was not a love marriage. It was kind of a reluctant marriage. He did not particularly like her, but he was trying to appease Velasquez. It didn't really work, as we'll see. But constantly is having affairs. Constantly. It is not a good marriage. So, slide 3, we get to the conquest of Mexico, which is the interesting part of Cortez's life. Now, he has shown some success and some initiative. He's rising in the ranks in Hispaniola. He participates in the army, so he's a military man. He's very intelligent. And Governor Velasquez, remember, he's married to Governor Velasquez's sister, gives him a charter to go into Mexico. And then he rescinds the charter at the last second. Now, this is interesting and important. So, Velasquez never really liked Cortés. This remains as a theme throughout Cortez's entire life. He just was. They seem to rub each other the wrong way. Velasquez seems to maybe think that Cortés did not respect his sister, and he really did not like that. He didn't like the way that Cortés was treating his sister, so the marriage kind of backfires a bit. Cortés, incidentally, does not care about any of this, so he decides to go into Mexico anyway, despite the fact that his charter is rescinded with his men. He claims the land he lands on in the name of Mexico, so he names it Mexico. He claims it in the name of Spain. An escaped priest who was a former slave for the Mayans. So if you remember the Mayan people, they were the big civilization that are located south of the Aztecs, closer to Central America and southern Mexico. There was a period of time where they were looked at as the less harsh version of the Aztecs. Recent scholarship has shown this to be not really true. They also had human sacrifice, but not as bad as the Aztecs, I guess. They were also pretty brutal, though. So, when he lands there, though, there's an escaped priest who was a former slave for the Mayans, and he was there for missionary reasons. He meets Cortés and his men, and he becomes his translator, which is a very big deal. So he arrives with his men into a town that he founds called Veracruz. And Cortés famously, and this is something you will see with great men, they will do these things that are like no going back, because we're either going to there's this boldness, right? Like, we're either going to become great or we're going to be nothing. Either we're going to do something remarkable or we die here. And Cortés does this. He scuttles his ships intentionally. So first, he rejects the authority. This rejects the authority of the governor of Cuba entirely. Now, there's no going back. You can't go back and tell him that you don't want to do this. The ships are gone, and now he is under the authority of the King of Spain. So he's gone all in. He is either going home a hero or he's going home a traitor. There's no in between. Or he's dying there. So we go to slide 4, the march to Tenochtitlan. So Cortés's greatest ability was that he rolled a nat 20 in charisma. And on the way to Mexico, he made alliances with several native tribes. At one point, he got into a series of 3 battles with the Tlaxcalans, being completely outnumbered by them and theoretically outmatched, but winning every battle, to the Tlaxcalans' shock. They were a proud warrior tribe. They did not expect Cortés to win every battle. They did not think that these outnumbered white men were going to be a match for them. And Cortés continues to win to the point where it almost seems supernatural. But Cortés is really, he's a genius. He realizes he needs the natives on his side because he has already ascertained at this point that the major power in the area is the Aztecs. And that's who he's gunning for already. They're the people who he needs, that he's going to be, if not fighting, that he wants to take over most of all. So he wants to win over the Tlaxcalans. So after every battle, he gives their prisoners back to them. And Cortés, quite wisely, keeps trying to make nice with the Tlaxcalans. And when Cortés wins that third battle, which they try and ambush him at night, but Cortés sees this coming and preps for it, and the Tlaxcalans are shocked again. And they agree to ally with Cortés when they realize that he's being nice to them, but he might not be so nice to the Aztecs because, and this is a recurring theme, everyone hated the Aztecs. Everyone hated the Aztecs. It is very hard to oversell how much everyone hated the Aztecs. They were an absolutely brutal culture. It's more than just the human sacrifice, although that was bad. But even more than that, like, the Aztecs had as far as I know, unique in history system of keeping everyone in line and weaker than them. They would intentionally force them to go to war with each other. And then the losers would, of these wars, which were called flower wars, would then be made into human sacrifices. And this would keep everybody, first, they wouldn't want to ally with each other because they were constantly fighting each other and killing each other. And second, they were always weaker than the Aztecs. So everyone hates the Aztecs, but they can't get along and are too well enough to ally together against them and are too weak on their own to fight them. But now Cortés is coming in and offering a third option. Maybe this guy can take out the Aztecs. I should also mention, this will come up in the histories a lot, at some point, Cortés gains an Aztec mistress, and he has many children with her, mestizo children. She is very, very important in translating for Cortés, much as that priest was important in translating with those more southern tribes initially. So I only mention her because she comes up in the history. People will try to make her bigger than she really is. In reality, what she was a translator. Now, translator is not a small job. It's a very important job. But that was her only job. And I don't want to... I think that sometimes people try and make her, the real power behind the throne or whatever, which is not true. She was important, but she was not as important as Cortés himself. So, slide 5. The arrival in Tenochtitlan. Cortés marches in with quite a large army, and Moctezuma II, who is the Aztec emperor, he let the Spanish into the city, attempting to find their weaknesses and crush them later. If you're wondering why I'm pausing every few seconds, I'm monitoring our chat to see if anybody is talking, but no one is right now. Anyway, when Cortés learns that Aztecs had killed some Spanish, he takes so there were Spanish, and they had a city a few miles away where some Spanish were holding up, and he learns that the Aztecs had killed some Spanish there. When Cortés learns this, he takes Moctezuma hostage, and he runs Tenochtitlan indirectly through Moctezuma. Meanwhile, Velázquez, you remember him? He is the governor of Cuba, the one who originally gave Cortés this charter to go into Mexico, then rescinded it, is furious about what Cortés is doing. So he sends in another expedition with the goal of finding and arresting Cortés, totaling around 1,100 men. So Cortés leaves Tenochtitlan with a small army, leaving the bulk of his men in Tenochtitlan. Now, this is one of the cooler things I noticed. He wins a small battle when he gets back, despite being outnumbered again, because Cortés is a genius. But after winning the battle, he's still outnumbered. They could just retreat, regroup, fight him again, and possibly win. By using his Nat 20 charisma, Cortés manages to convince the new expedition to join him. Because at this point, it looks as if he's basically single-handedly taken over the Aztec Empire. So you have this expedition of 1,100 men, a massive amount of men, for this period of time, right? In where they're considering where they're located, what they started with. This is a lot of men, like contextually. Cortés probably brought like what 200, 300 with him, and the rest are in Tenochtitlan. Like 600 men plus their native allies are occupying Tenochtitlan at this time, and these men, these 1,100 men, have been sent with the specific goal of arrest Cortés. He's not supposed to be here. He's breaking the law. And instead, Cortés manages to convince them to join him. That's how charismatic Cortés was. He talks the men who were sent there to arrest him into joining him. And Velasquez copes and seethes. Nothing he could do about it. He loses all of his men. So, the mismanagement by Cortés's men. This is slide 6. So, mismanagement by Cortés's men. Back in Tenochtitlan, the guy Cortés put in charge becomes horrified by the human sacrifice of the Aztecs, and he committed what was known as the Massacre of the Great Temple. Sources dispute exactly what happened, but during a festival celebration, Pedro de Alvarado, the guy who was put in charge, massacres everyone in the Great Temple of the Aztecs. This includes women and children. It is to be noted that even the Spanish sources note the cruelty of what happened. They say it lacked Christian piety. There's some dispute. The Aztecs claim that it was because the Spanish wanted their gold or their jewelry. The Spanish claim it was because they were horrified by the human sacrifice going on. What's the truth? Who really knows? Maybe some combination of the two. But however, it also doesn't really matter because the Spanish were particularly cruel. They were sacrificing people who very definitely had nothing to do with the human sacrifice going on, innocent people like women and children. And Cortés was not happy with this. So, one thing that is interesting about Cortés is that he's always around people doing particularly heinous and horrible things, but it's pretty rare that he's ever directly implicated in it. Like, the massacre at the Great Temple is probably the worst thing that the Spanish did in this conquest of the Aztecs, and Cortés was not there for it. He was gone. He was dealing with the, his attempted arrest. And when he learns about it, he's not happy about this. And he was correct not to be. This was a bad move by the Spanish. Rebellion foments. Moctezuma II is killed. The Spanish claim he was stoned by the Aztecs. It's possible the Spanish killed him when they realize that he's a failure and he's not able to stop the rebellion. Who knows? Could really go either way. And this eventually leads to a rushed and disastrous retreat from Tenochtitlan. This is pretty famous. You'll see it described in both Aztec and Spanish sources. Cortés and his men barely escape. They lose a lot of their treasure. Their rear guard is slaughtered. It's bad. So not a good time for Cortés. Now, here's something interesting that came up during this point is I did not know about this. It's called the Battle of Otumbo, or Otumbo, possibly. So, it's one of those very underrated battles that changed history, because this is actually quite an important battle on the overall world stage. If you remember that it was Cortés who was responsible for the conquest of the Aztecs and the takeover of Mexico, and even its eventual conversion to Christianity. A lot is riding on Cortés's expedition right now. So, in the Battle of Otumbo, the Aztecs had every chance to win and completely crush Cortés's conquest. They underestimate the Spanish. They consider them already defeated. Uh, so basically, after this retreat, the Spanish are disorganized. They lose a lot of men in their rear guard. They lose a lot of their arms, and they are very desperately retreating. They're also badly outnumbered. They don't have their native allies around them. So the Aztec think they've already lost. We're going to win. And because they think that this battle is pretty much all but won already, their goal isn't even to kill the Spanish at this point. They think it's going to be so easy that they don't even need to focus on killing them. They want to capture the Spanish alive to use for sacrifice. Cortés manages to win this battle, and he wins it against very long odds. It's not easy, but he manages it. And he wins it for two reasons. First, he quite correctly and cleverly realized that the Aztecs depended very heavily on their leaders in the battle. So, despite being outnumbered, he focuses his men on the most important people in the battle, the leaders, who are dressed differently than the rest of the troops. And he was right. Like, by attacking the leaders, the forces became much more disorganized. They didn't know what to do. They were forced to retreat when more and more leaders got killed. And the Spanish had one other advantage, which is that they had cavalry. The Aztecs were completely unused to fighting cavalry. People think of horses as a Native American, as a native thing, an American Indian thing. It is not true. Horses came from Europe. They were introduced to the Americas with the Europeans. Some native groups did become very, very good with horses, but this was by no means true of all of them. The Aztecs were completely unused to fighting cavalry, and they were unprepared for dealing with repeated cavalry charges. So cavalry would rush in, the Aztec couldn't kill them, and then they would rush out, and then they would come back. So it was happening over and over again, and the Aztecs had no idea how to deal with this. So due to Cortés's brilliance in realizing that they needed to focus their troops on the right people and to good Spanish tactics, the Spanish managed to survive the battle and retreat a few miles away to safety. So they lived to fight another day, but this is an underrated moment in world history. Caitlin is here. Hello, Caitlin. Right, if this battle had gone differently, then the entire conquest of Mexico could have been stopped in its tracks right here. But that is not what happened. So, once again, we're going to repeat the thing. Cortés is now bruised and battered. The Aztecs appear to have turned things around and driven the Spanish from their city. But Cortés has one thing going for him. Everyone hated the Aztecs. Everyone hated the Aztecs. And Cortés is still alive, and he's still got that nat 20 charisma. So, with the help of native allies and new allies from Cuba, because people around are seeing all of this going down, and even the Spanish, even Velasquez, the governor of Cuba, who does not want Cortés there, has tried to bring him back once, has wisened up and realized that, hey, there is like a really good opportunity here. I can't just like completely squash it. So Velasquez swallows his pride here. And he sends in he sends in more Spanish. Along with the native allies, Cortés cuts off Tenochtitlan from its allied cities and surrounds it. So the cities surrounding Tenochtitlan, he uses his native who are bringing it supplies. Cortés uses his native allies to cut those cities off, and then with his men and some more native allies, he surrounds Tenochtitlan. This siege goes on for a while, and the Aztecs finally surrender. And then once again, you get one of these interesting moments in history where the surrender of Tenochtitlan was pretty terrible. Tenochtitlan was slaughtered. And this is partially by the Spanish. Like, don't get me wrong, the Spanish were not innocent in the siege of Tenochtitlan and the rape and slaughter of Tenochtitlan, but a lot of it was done by the native groups who hated the Aztecs. So after the Aztecs surrendered, the battle was already over. Spain had won, and they it's the native groups largely, not entirely, but largely, who continue the slaughter and kill everyone and kill all the women and children and rape all of the women and loot the city, right? Not the Spanish. And it was not under Cortez's orders by any means. Like, it happened, and you could argue perhaps that Cortez should have done more to stop it, but it was not under Cortez's orders. So Tenochtitlan was renamed Mexico City, which is its name to this day. Interestingly, the Aztec emperor was not killed until later when he was hanged for treason while on a Spanish expedition to Guatemala. I don't think it was hard for me to find and confirm this, but I do not think that Cortez wanted to do this. Like, I don't think he wanted to kill the Aztec emperor. I think he was unhappy about this, but nevertheless, it happened. So, after the conquest, this is my slide 9. So, in the character of Cortez, he could come off as rather vain in his letters, and he did admit to disobeying orders. He was made governor of New Spain, which was, of course, the Spanish colony of Mexico, but had 4 other people basically sent to watch him closely, which Cortez did not appreciate. So he sends these letters to the king. He comes across as kind of vain, as he gives himself the most responsibility in taking Mexico. He doesn't credit the natives probably as much as they deserve. Though it was kind of funny to see. I was reading one thing that said the natives didn't get anything out of it outside of the destruction of the Aztecs. And I'm thinking to myself, that's exactly what they wanted. They didn't want anything but the destruction of the Aztecs. That's how much they hated the Aztecs. But he really was the main driver, though. So he had some cause to be upset that they were not appreciating him enough. After he's made governor of the colony in Mexico, 4 other people are also sent to be like or lieutenant governors, and they're there to watch him closely, basically. Cortez did not appreciate this. He understood that that's what was going on. He argues his case to the king, but the king of Spain also happened to be, at this point in time, the Holy Roman Emperor, and he was busy dealing with his own crap in Europe. So he really had no time for Cortez. So he's just like, whatever, you're governor, but you're going to be watched. Deal with it. And Velasquez is also still at this point. He still does not like Cortez. I don't think that the entire I'm going to go behind your back and invade in Mexico thing made Cortez very popular. Right? I don't think that made him very popular with Velasquez. The fact that it was a success didn't really help matters because it just makes Velasquez look bad. So he is still like constantly interfering with Cortez and pushing in and needling Cortez in this time. However, there is one thing about Cortez that's interesting from this point. Cortez did play a big part in converting the New World to Christianity. Like, specifically, it was a goal of his. It wasn't just an incidental thing. Like, now that they're Spanish, Christians are going to come. He wanted to convert them to Christianity. He took a vested interest in it. Like, he was paying attention, right? He specifically asked for mendicant friars. So, little Catholic theology, and ecclesiology time. The mendicant orders are like the wandering beggar orders. Most famously, the 2 big ones are the Franciscans and the Dominicans. And Cortez wants mendicant friars. So he doesn't want regular priests sent in. He wants them to be part of one of these mendicant orders. Since, according to him, the regular priests in Spain were so corrupt, it would hurt the cause of the faith if the natives saw them. I found this really interesting because it tells me that Cortez was genuine, right, in wanting to convert the people of Mexico to Christianity. It was not an idle thing, right? It was not something that is just like, yeah, sure, send in whoever, and they'll be Christian, and then they'll win. He was concerned for their souls, right? Like, he was concerned enough that he wanted to make sure that the people who were sent to convert them were good, moral, holy people. And The Spanish crown agrees with him, actually, and they send in Franciscans. They're known as the 12 Apostles of Mexico, actually. And Cortés, at least according to a couple of sources, though not all of them, so it's possible that this was like a later legend. I like to think it happened, though, because there are more sources that attest to it than not. Cortés famously bows to the Franciscans on their arrival, which is a symbolically powerful sign of deference to spiritual authority. And the Franciscans, for their part, speak very highly of Cortés. They talk about him as like a new Moses, brought them to like the promised land, and he opened them up to a new land. Uh, so Cortés seems to be very genuine in wanting to bring the natives to Christianity. He wanted them to be introduced to good, holy Christians. He was concerned for the example it would give for the state of their souls. And he understands that his work is not as important as the work of the church in bringing souls to Christ. So, if there is a saving grace in all of Cortez's flaws, his vanity, his pride, his womanizing, and his affairs that he has overseas, and he does get into a second marriage eventually when he comes back to Spain, but uh, there is a core to him that seems to be genuine, right? In his love of Christ and his desire to save souls. So in slide 10, you go later disputes with the Spanish, and to summarize a long history, Cortés kept having issues with the Spanish and petty power plays with him. Velasquez continues to really dislike him. There's a lot of different things that happen at this point, so there's no real point in going over all of them. Just, he's on different campaigns to different countries, but Velasquez is constantly needling at him during this time, not giving him as much power as Cortés believes he's earned. At his first return to Spain, Cortés is highly honored by the Spanish king. Though he went back to Mexico, he was never again given a leadership position in Mexico, so he's never made a governor again or anything like that. And his first return, I should say that the king was very effusive in his praise. He gave Cortés a coat of arms, which was a very, very high honor, right? And Cortés still doesn't really think he's being honored enough, to be honest. I think Cortés suspects that a lot of this is like appeasement by the king to kind of shut him up from making any real further complaints about the way he was treated. Because again, he's never given another leadership position. So he goes back to Mexico. After a second trip back to Spain, he got little attention. Like, people just kind of forgot about him, which is sad considering all that he did. And he forces his way through a crowd to see the king. And the king actually asks to sit who he was. Like, he sees this man force his way through the crowd and goes, "Wow, what an impudent man. Who do you think you are?" And Cortés is said to have responded, "I am a man who has given you more provinces than your ancestors left you cities." Which I think we can all agree is really dope and very, very cool. Uh, just a very metal line. All of these great men, I feel like they got to say something that's at least one really cool line at one point in their life, and that is Cortés's. Uh, so slide 11, Cortés's death and legacy. So Cortés dies of pleurisy, just a disease, right? In debt and bitter. He was very bitter at his treatment. He had used up a lot of his own money in the expeditions to Mexico and in his travels back and forth. So he was not rich at this point. He was in debt. And he was a flawed man. He cheated on his first wife multiple times and did not really love her. He was a womanizer his entire life. Again, you have this legend from even when he was a very young man, he injures himself escaping from the apartment of a married woman. He was full of pride and vanity. He had this extraordinary ability to convince people to do what he wanted, but he always ends up alienating people along the way. Like, he could talk anyone onto his side, but in doing so, there'll be other people who are alienated by him, who he annoys with his arrogance, with his often justified arrogance, but it's still is an alienating thing when you have this person who seems to think the rules do not apply to him. And you even see this in that very last story. Like, his entire life, that seems to be Cortez's main thing. I'm Cortez. I'm amazing. The rules don't apply to me. And, that's why he elbows his way through the crowd to see the king and then justifies it on the fact of, because I'm Cortez, right? Now, in a sense, because Cortez was such a great man, this is true. Right? Like, normal rules don't apply to a man like Cortez. But on the other hand, you can't outrun human nature, right? You can't say, well, I'm Cortez, therefore I'm not human. And he dies in debt. He dies bitter. He dies with people not acknowledging his legacy because that's, the rules do apply to you. They apply to you even if you accomplish, and let's be honest here, some of the most extraordinary and important things accomplished by one man in all of human history, right? He was not a saint. He was in no way a saint. I would not call him a saint, but when you consider the things that he did, the conquering of the Aztec Empire is one of the most extraordinary feats ever accomplished in the annals of human history. I mean, they were a dominant empire. They outnumbered the Spanish considerably. And let's be honest here, the Spanish were not exactly the good guys, but the Aztecs were evil. They were straight up evil. Someone had to take them out. Uh, they were an evil culture who worshipped evil gods and did evil things. They treated people in brutal, militaristic, just awful, awful ways. Somebody had to stop them, and that someone was Cortez. And to his credit, he seemed genuine in his Christian faith. While the Spanish did not always treat the natives with what the sources sometimes call Christian piety, it is surprisingly rare that you see Cortez directly implicated in this. It always seems to happen with other people associated with, around Cortez, but not Cortez directly. And he took a genuine interest in ensuring Christianity was represented properly to the natives. Like, this was something that was important to him, that he thought it over. Like, what is the best way that we can do this? I think you need to make sure that you're sending in priests who are incorruptible, who have good morals, who can give a good Christian example, right? And that's something that is admirable on Cortez's part. Vanessa Vasquez is on. Hello, Vanessa. I don't think Cortez is worthy of being canonized, but he is worthy of being remembered. We should remember what he did in the conquest of Mexico. We should remember what he did in taking out the Aztecs, and we should recognize that what he did was extraordinary. It required a combination of military genius, genius in governorship, genius in negotiation, and charisma, again, which is really the main thing that you get from Cortez, is that he was a smooth talker. He could talk his way out of anything. Honestly, I feel like there's a connection here with how good he was at, about his womanizing too, right? Like, Cortez was such a smooth talker, right? And for good or for ill. Ultimately, I think, it goes back to what I was saying. I think there's a difference between a great man and a saint, right? Maximilian Kolbe was a saint. He was an extraordinary saint. He is one of the men I admire most in the world. He is not a great man, right? He's not a great man, but he is a saint. Cortez is not a saint. He is in no way or shape or form a saint, but he is a great man. And I think that he is a great man who, in some ways, I hope that paradise, right, that heaven, that the afterlife, that the Lord looks fondly upon Cortez in the end. Because I feel like, even with his flaws, I think that Cortez was trying. I think that he made his effort, that he wanted Christianity to succeed. and I hope that God looks fondly upon that in the end. So, what can we learn from Cortés? Well, I think the main thing that you need to learn from Cortés, I would say it's humility. The rules apply to even you. If they apply to Hernan Cortés, a man who accomplished one of the most extraordinary feats in human history, the rules certainly apply to you. Even Hernan Cortés dies in debt and bitter. Even Hernan Cortés needs to take into account what other people think of him. And if he does, you do too. No man is an island. And I think that's a good spot to end it.
Excellent. Uh, so I have some questions about Hernan Cortez, less about his life, but more about how he conducted himself in battles. Would you say that he was, certainly physically courageous, but do you think he is also the author of his strategic victories? At least in so much as men are author of any victory in battle.
Right. I would say yes. Yeah, there's a certain genius. They seem to talk of him leading the battles and coming up with the plans and things. Like, you got to understand, it's hard for me to get this across because I'm not a military historian, and Cortez isn't a man like Hannibal or Yi Sun Sin, where their main thing is military, so there isn't as much like, on their battle tactics. But Cortez was a genius. Like he was a military genius. Uh, he is winning these battles outnumbered, outgunned, right? Like, yes, the Spanish did have some advantages, namely better armor, better weapons, right? Uh, but I don't think that these advantages were enough to overcome the fact that they were in almost every battle wildly outnumbered, right? The
Right.
things that made this possible were, first, Cortez was a genius. Again, like the Battle of Otumbo was probably his finest moment battle wise because he was dealing with like a demoralized Spanish force versus a freshly victorious Aztec force. And not only was the Spanish force demoralized, they were also badly outnumbered at this point and were retreating, right? Like, this was as
Hmm.
primed for a loss as any battle could possibly have been. But Cortez managed to correctly find the path to victory in this battle. He realized that they had one advantage, which was their cavalry, and that if they wanted to even the odds, they needed to make sure that they were killing men strategically, meaning go for the leaders, and that's exactly what he did. Uh, and that is a testament to the genius of Hernan Cortez, right? Like, he saw his opportunities and took them.
Excellent. Is there anything else you'd like to cover before moving on?
Anything else I'd like to cover? Let's see. Um, I guess the only thing I'd want to say is that if I do think that in terms of were they in the right, were the Spanish in the right for taking out the Aztecs? I would say yes. Right? Like, it is very, very hard to undersell how bad the Aztecs were. And I get that we have the sort of audience that's going to agree with us on this, but not everybody will, right? Like, so I do want to emphasize that the Aztecs were truly awful. And that's one of the reasons that this was even possible, right? Like, if it was just a normal Indian tribe, basically, I don't think that Cortez would have been able to do it. It's the fact that it was the Aztecs that everybody saw this group coming in and saying, "Hey, we want to take on the Aztecs." And then they said, "Oh, you want to take on the Aztecs? Well, let me help you." Right? Like, constantly we see this happen. Tribes keep allying with the Spanish, and it's because the people who the Spanish are going to ultimately be fighting are the Aztecs. In the realms of human history, if I were to look at cultures that I know for a fact were worse, like, the only ones I could really think of, like the Comanche, uh, are probably a worse culture. Uh, the Canaanites, which may have turned into the Phoenicians, like which were the Carthaginians. Uh, they were probably a worse culture or as bad. But that's like how low on the depravity scale we're going with the Aztecs here. There's also something interesting. Now I know you read. So Vox Day posted this article, that was a about the philosophy of the Aztecs and how it was actually quite similar to modern scientific materialism. I don't know if you remember that article, Ben.
I do not.
I wish I could. If I can find it, I'll link it. I'll share it with you. But it was really interesting. Basically, the Aztecs believed that the end of the world was inevitable. It was coming. Think like Ragnarok or something like that. But they had a different attitude towards it than the Vikings did. The Vikings had a sort of like, almost admirable stoicism. Now the Vikings were brutal killers. I think that there's sometimes a little bit over admiration of the Vikings who would murder and loot and kill their way through and were known for like their reign of terror, right? And sometimes people admire them a little too much. Uh, with that said, there is a sort of nobility to the Viking view of the end times where they have like this doomed afterlife, but just because it's doomed doesn't mean it's not worth fighting for, right? Sort of noble stoicism. The Aztecs did not have that. They were doomed, the world was going to end, and the Aztecs were terrified of this fact. It was an inevitability. There was no way to stop it. The only thing you could do potentially was slow it down. And the only way to slow it down is by keeping up the religious rituals, and that meant with human sacrifice. Lots of human sacrifice. Uh, and they said, I want you to think about this in terms of modern scientific materialism, which looks at like global warming. The world is going to end, right? There is a definite end time. We can't stop it. Each human life, as a result, is each individual human life is inconsequential in this paradigm, both the Aztec and the modern materialistic, right? So one person dies, who cares? We're trying to keep all of humanity going for as long as it possibly can. And therefore, anything we do is justified if it keeps the human race going for just a little bit longer. Human sacrifice, right? Perhaps population control.
Right,
Uh,
right.
Things like that. There is a disturbing parallel between Aztec uh, mythology and modern scientific materialism that should really make people pause more. And that is where, so I am in favor of, I think that Cortés, in taking out the Aztecs, there's the whole meme, like Cortés did nothing wrong, right? I wouldn't go in a scholarly discussion like this. I would not go that far, but I would say that in conquering the Aztecs, Cortés did nothing wrong.
Excellent. One moment.
Okay, while Ben prepares his thing on Cromwell, I am gonna, I don't know, imagine me juggling in the background to entertain all of you. I don't have a joke off the top of my head. Otherwise, I would tell you all jokes.
Yep, yep. Don't worry about it. No need to go crazy or anything. Uh, so, for my man, I chose Oliver Cromwell. The reason why I chose Oliver Cromwell is because I do look up to him in a way. But my question after Windigoon's breakdown of Ted Kaczynski's life and legacy, I did want to look and see how much of him is quote unquote the meme, and how much is him being a good man or an evil man. And in the end, I've come to certain conclusions about him that how do I want to put it? It's very complicated. Uh, First, it seems that as Oliver Cromwell went through his life, things happened to him, and when they happened to him, he grappled them with every single ounce of power he had in his mind and body. When he became saved, he did not just become a Christian and sort of give himself up to feel goods or some wishy washy, oh, I'm a Christian now sort of thing. He went for it whole hog. When he was given command of the army, he went for it whole hog under Lord Fairfax. When he was pacifying the Irish, as we'll call it, he didn't stop. Every time he had something to hand, he attacked it with vigor and labor that, quite frankly, is rare to see among great men. Let's go over his life briefly. Cromwell may sound like a name that's very familiar from Henry VIII's minister Thomas Cromwell. Thomas Cromwell is his great uncle or great great uncle. I'm never quite sure about the greats. Um, but essentially his sister's grandson, I think. Let me just see here. Descended, oh, it just says descended from the family. Um, he has very few personal letters that, sorry, I'll go back over Thomas Cromwell. Henry VIII is an interesting man that Anthony and I have gone over quite a few times. He's interesting because of his degeneracy, but also from the sheer before and after of Henry VIII's life. There is England before Henry VIII. There is England after Henry VIII, as strongly as it is with Elizabeth I, Victoria. I don't know if I want to say Victoria, as weird as that is. She has an age named after her. Uh, it's one of those things where life actually continued on after Victoria, much the same as it was until World War One. Quite frankly, or at least it seems like that to me in what I've read. Then you have before and after Alfred, before and after Henry II, that sort of thing. And quite frankly, I mean that in a good way, even though Henry VIII's crimes are many and numerous. There is a certain amount of how do I want to put it, sympathy one should have for him in the life that he lived and the people that died around him, as well as the state of England at the time. Uh, the reason for the Protestant Reformation reaching England is not as simple as I want a divorce. It could even be as complex as I believe this Habsburg witch killed some of my stillborn children and maybe even my brother. You could play with these ideas quite a bit, and Henry VIII is not here to defend himself. In the same way with the Catholic religion within England at the time of his reign, it owned a third of the land of England. There was a lot of oppression and damage that was being done as England sort of became more awake, more unified after the wars, that quite frankly was never going to be given up and never going to be used as profitably as it should be. There were many religious extreme. How do I want to put it? There were many religious extremist thoughts going around England at the time, which was not anything new. England was a source of many reformers like Wycliffe, but what was happening is that there were many. Um, it was kicking up into a fever pitch. John Knox arrived in Scotland, and there were many other reformers within England, like William Tyndale, who was killed by the church. So it wasn't as, shall we say, top down as people expect. Yes, Henry VIII was the catalyst that severed the church, but, and I want to be very clear on this, whatever his crimes were, his choices were accepted by the majority of the English population, or at least an elite majority enough that the people don't matter en masse. And Thomas Cromwell was, Oliver Cromwell was a part of that elite that came out of that sort of mindset, that period. His family had some money from lands that were taken from the Catholic Church during Henry VIII's purge and creation of Protestantism within England. And what's more, he was a fervent supporter of Puritanism, as well as, you know, how do I want to put it? Even though he was not a great theological thinker, he tended to use whatever language was provided for him. It is very clear that he and others staunchly pursued Jesus Christ. I will remind our modern audience, especially when I read this letter, that his language is limited to what he himself understood from his own readings of the Bible and the commentaries that were being provided. While these days we tend to look down on actual Puritans, they're Calvinists, they have a whole bunch of problems with some of their theology, and they tended to be a bit wacky when left alone for a bit. Uh, it's very clear that for some of them, especially men who the traditions that would evolve into Jonathan Edwards and others, that these people sought Christ. So the first actual event in Oliver. I'm going to say Thomas Cromwell all the time now. I hate it. Oliver Cromwell's life that matters is his conversion to Christianity away from a cultural perspective and into a true perspective. Let's see here. Yet to honor, this is a letter to his cousin, yet to honor my God by declaring what he hath done for my soul, in this I am confident, and I will be so. Truly then this I find, that he giveth springs in a dry, barren wilderness where no water is. I live, you know where, in Meshech, which they say signifies prolonging, in Kedar, which signifies blackness, yet the Lord forsaketh me not. Though he do prolong, yet he will, I trust, uh, bring me to his tabernacle, to his resting place. My soul is with the congregation of the firstborn, my body rests in hope, and if here I may honor my God, either by doing or suffering, I shall be most glad. He talks again for a bit. The Lord, yes, the Lord accept me in his Son, and give me to walk in the light, and give us to walk in the light, as he is the light. He is he it is that enlighteneth our blackness, our darkness. I dare not say he hideth his face from me. He giveth me to see light in his light. One beam in a dark place hath exceeding much refreshment in it. Blessed be his name for shining upon so dark a heart as mine. You know what my manner of life hath been. Oh, I lived in and loved darkness and hated light. I was a chief and I was a chief, the chief of sinners. This is true. I hated godliness, yet God had mercy on me. Oh, the riches of his mercy. Praise him for me. Pray for me that he who hath begun a good work would perfect it in the day of Christ. And he continues on. It is very clear to me from language like that, which I have seen in other people who have been saved, that this man was a Christian. Uh, and even as Cortés has these moments of faith that burn through his wrath and his lust and and pride and all these other things, so too that as Oliver Cromwell persecutes Catholics, as he slaughters Irishmen, though to be clear, it's sometimes a similar matter as Cortés, where it is his men who do so, not necessarily under his orders, and more. I hope to show that his zeal in grasping for Christ also exists in his zeal to protect England and to do what he believes necessary to preserve the land and soul of England. Uh, we'll continue on. The next few pieces of his life that are important vaguely are his becoming a member of Parliament. Um, he didn't do much. In fact, people are basically saying, yeah, he was kind of a waste. Nobody liked him, but he was, sort of put up there by others. Then Charles I removed Parliament for quite some time, and he was, you know, not in Parliament. Charles I ruled without a Parliament for 11 years. One of the things that confuses people about Charles I is his sort of relation with Catholicism and the religious thought around him. At the time that Charles I was ruling, uh, there were several movements of thought among monarchy, but especially absolute monarchy. The king should rule the land that he has been given over to by God as an absolute ruler. It worked in France vaguely until it didn't, and then it stopped working very hard. And then, it worked in Spain and it worked in other places. The Habsburgs were big proponents of this idea. Um, and it led to many wars, and especially wars of religion. Though I'm not going to claim that that was the only reason that these wars happened. Uh, he ruled as an absolute ruler for 11 years, and then he faced the Bishops' War, which was started because he demanded that Scotland had a more Anglican, quote unquote Anglican, really it was very Catholic, prayer book. Uh, these are not literate peasants, and those that are literate are not religiously educated in ways that we would understand today. They did not have Strong's Concordance. They did not have access to Thomas Aquinas' works. They probably barely could understand the catechism that they've been given if they're Catholic, and they certainly didn't understand the subtleties of certain Protestant ideas that were promoted by Luther and John Knox and others. In fact, it's pretty clear that they kind of look at these ideas and go, so we're elected to salvation. So it's predestined? Like it's one of those things where it's like, I understand the words, I do not understand the application. But they did have a very good system of prayer books. These prayer books were similar, but not quite similar to things like Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name, thy kingdom come, thy work be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. Um, there were many different prayers that they could pray, that they could memorize, that they could use for religious instruction. Uh, the purpose was not to, and it obviously enforced religious dogma. The purpose was not to railroad people into this. Why am I going over these things? I'm not even mentioning Oliver Cromwell. Well, this is the fertile ground he lived in. Charles demanded money for this war. Parliament demanded concessions, uh, and it kept going for quite some time. In the end, it was culminated with Parliament demanding uh, some of Charles I's allies to be arrested, and no, that wasn't happening. And they fought the English Civil War. This is where Cromwell matters. I want to be very clear. While Cromwell was present in many of these notices, and he was, as a radical Christian, very much against certain religious choices that Charles I was making. What's more, in the context of the Huguenot persecution that was happening across the Channel, it was very clear to just about every Protestant that there was a chance that if the Huguenots were to go down, they would go down too, eventually. So there's not just the context of England as in a bubble, but if they were also seeing the religious wars in Germany, the wars in France with the Huguenots, who sometimes gave as good as they got, but quite frankly, the ending results were done under the flag of peace. and then they were massacred. Uh, though, quite frankly, I'm so like that's not accurate. Like it's complicated, but they never had a Huguenot king in France that I remember anyway. So you can't really say that there were Protestant kings like there were in England. I want to be clear on that. So there were power differentials that, quite frankly, I think motivated these guys quite a bit more than historians give them credit for. Cromwell was given control over a cavalry formation and distinguished himself. So they gave him more power. Cromwell continued on to distinguish himself, killing quite a few cavaliers and keeping things together. He also imported different strategies, like keeping the horsemen in very tight formations that kept the mass of the cavalry charge intact. Um, in the end, it led to him uh, for helping. Excuse me. It led to him working with Sir Thomas Fairfax to create the New Model Army. Sir Thomas Fairfax, to be clear, was the number one, and he was number two, uh, which wiped the floor with the Cavaliers. I've read over this quite a bit, and it just never seems like there was any real chance for for the Cavaliers to defeat the New Model Army. Cromwell is a definite example of somebody who was thrown into a pressure cooker and took advantage of everything he had. He didn't seem to ever have a good mind for business, but when it came to military tactics and leading men, as well as sort of keeping things in line, he was absolutely excelled. He was a bruiser, not in the sense of physicality, but certainly in personality. As things went with the Second Civil War, uh, after some shenanigans happened with the body of the king, they put the king to trial, and Cromwell was instrumental in keeping things in line for Charles I to be executed. And I want to be clear on where I stand on this. I believe the execution of Charles I was an unequivocally good thing, partially because of Charles I's tyranny, but also because it is the number one thing that kept absolute monarchy out of England. It is clear to me through my studies of France and other places that absolute monarchy works when the absolute monarch is a good monarch. When the monarch is even slightly weak than the one before, bad things happen. And it gets worse, and then it gets worse, and then usually their children pay the cost. Therefore, I determine that it is an unrighteous philosophy. God does not take a single generation's view of things. He takes multiple generations. He demands that people leave, in Proverbs, he calls those righteous who leave an inheritance for their grandchildren. It is clear to me through my study of the scripture that God judges man's hearts, not their political party. And Charles I, through his many crimes, he would arrest people who would not loan him money and have them executed. He often raided people who were not his allies and give gifts of their land to his allies. There was many things like that he did that caused fear, caused anger. You would never sure if the king was showing up to ask for money or to raid your crops and land and money. Um, the the whole thing that I'm looking at here is that even though the reasoning and law that they used to kill him, execute him for his crimes, was weak, partially because no one had really done this before. Usually there is another monarch deposing a wicked monarch, or a wicked monarch deposing a good monarch, or Caesar or emperor or whatever you have. It is not done by parliament. Therefore, lacking the force of will of one man to rule the country, they had to justify this legally. And while I consider it weak, it was very much necessary to preserve the nation and to preserve the gains that they had kept for their freedom and their godliness. Charles I was a Catholic. Charles I married Catholic. He promoted Catholics. It is very clear that if he had absolute control, well, quote unquote, absolute control, that he would make the nation Catholic. And I believe that through the prayer book and other things that caused the original Civil War that started this, the Bishops' War, that he was going for it. Uh, in the end, Oliver Cromwell is able to bully people enough to sign the death warrant, and he keeps things in line. Other people were, more instrumental in the speeches, in the ideas, and so on and so forth. Really, Oliver Cromwell just controlled those men who were military guards, uh, but he was able to get people to see his way of things, which is all they needed. They declared a republic, which didn't work so well, um, and in the end, uh, Cromwell shows his face again properly uh, with the invasion of Ireland. Uh, as well as the various and to be clear, this was in response to various mutinies over, quite frankly, it seemed poor management from the Commonwealth and resentment over the execution of Charles I. Cromwell bloodily cuts through Ireland and takes much of their land and distributes it out to Protestants. Uh, it's very clear that he took their support of Charles I and their support of Catholic monarchs and Catholic ideas as seriously as he would sin in his own life, uh, and acted in such a way to oppress them and to ensure that Protestants are being blessed from Catholic largesse, we'll say. Uh, here his Here is his own statement after he massacred about 3,000 royalist soldiers, 3,500 it looks like. Uh, though accounts dispute it, this is what he says in his own words. I am persuaded that this is a righteous judgment of God upon these barbarous wretches who have imbrued their hands in so much innocent blood that it will tend to prevent the effusion of blood for the future, which are satisfactory grounds for such actions, which otherwise cannot but work remorse and regret. There were some other massacres that occurred, but quite frankly, this is the same thing as Cortés. In some cases, he was actively trying to seek surrender, and some soldiers massacred the town. You can see this several times here. Um, and it's pretty clear also that, there would be massacres on the other side if given the chance, but no such luck. This is also when many royalists started going to Virginia and to Maryland too, creating sort of the cavalier culture that Virginia was very famous for, and continue to keep it separate from the more northern regions of Massachusetts and other such um, places, colonies. It says here the public practice of Catholicism was banned, and Catholic priests were killed when captured. All Catholic owned land was confiscated under the Act of the Settlement of Ireland of 1652 and given to Scottish and English settlers. Ulster, a lot of this became. Um, Parliament's financial creditors and Parliament soldiers. The remaining Catholic landowners were allocated poorer land in the province of Connacht under the Commonwealth. Catholic land ownership dropped from 60% to just 8%. And quite frankly, I do not care what happens to Ireland. Ireland has been conquered by every group that has ever bothered to reach out its hand to conquer it. Uh, the Romans only did not conquer Ireland because they literally didn't care enough. Uh, there's no evidence of failed invasions like there are of Arabia and the Sudan and more southern African provinces. There's, they put a king in back in charge and then left. Uh, and when the tribute stopped coming, if they received tribute at all, none of them looked at each other and went, "We should go conquer that." They didn't care. Like there's very little that Ireland has done that has mattered outside Ireland before they came to America. So I have no opinion on the effect on Ireland. Uh, as we're seeing now in the modern day, it is pretty clear that the Irish are unable to be governed to take control of themselves. Some riots in the street does not a movement make. Overall, there were some other campaigns. The Battle of Dunbar, uh, after the Scots tried to proclaim Charles II as king. Uh, but quite frankly, you know, it doesn't really amount to anything. Uh, George Monk shows up here pretty well, and he'll be very important after Cromwell is dead. Uh, the Scottish never really, they just didn't care. Like, it's weird. Like, I kind of look at the effects, and there aren't any effects. Charles II went back to France or wherever he was. Like, they didn't even really capture him. Overall, there were some failed parliaments. Um, again, Cromwell keeps control via his new model army. And then the next major thing that seems to matter is the protectorate that starts in 1653, where he's made the Lord Protector and is even offered the crown. However, uh, he does not accept it. Even though he doesn't like refuse it in a very public way like Caesar does, though he was offered it in a festival. Cromwell spends time, thinks about it, and in the end does not accept it. Uh, he has two major goals: healing and settling uh, the damage after the Civil War. And it seems to me that he definitely went for it. He did not destroy his enemies like he could have. He did not seem to uh, uh, bother with the certain, shall we say, vindictiveness that other rulers have. He set to it. Um, he had the power of a king, and in the end, did not abuse it in the same way that Charles I had and others. Uh, healing and settling, and let's see here. Where is the other one? His two goals. Where is Oh, there we go. Spiritual and moral reform. Uh, famously he banned Christmas or Christmas celebrations. Uh, he was concerned with the soul of his people. One of the things that sort of keeps him from becoming a king and becoming sort of a Caesar in the sense that Julius Caesar was is that Cromwell did care very much about the spiritual nature of his people. Even though we can look and see his cruelty towards Catholics and his disdain for Irish lives, it is very clear that he did not stop thinking about them, both in relation to his rule and their relation to God. He did not want the sin of regicide, quote unquote sin, to be the dominant force of the English psyche for the rest of its existence. He understood that these things do blacken the soul of a people. And so his goal was not to, have Charles II strangled, in a bar in France or something ridiculous like that, but rather his focus was on the English people themselves. Uh, he says, although Cromwell declared to the First Protectorate Parliament that government by one man and a parliament is fundamental, uh, social in practice, social priorities took precedence over forms of government. Such forms were, he said, but dross and dung in comparison of Christ. Uh, there's only so much a man can do to reform a people under him, but he did put forward what he could, and quite frankly, I believe that there is a spiritual rot that was running through England that started to grow as those who desired a frontier took it. And the same spirit that animated Cromwell animated the Yankees, uh, but those who stayed home slowly degraded. When Charles II came into power after Richard Cromwell, Oliver's son, gave it up, it's very clear that the people went back to drinking and whoring and all these other things that Cromwell had banned. Uh, it is very clear that the lessons that Cromwell, uh, internalized in his own heart, were not followed really by anyone else but Cromwell and his Roundheads. The Protectorate continued on. He ended the First Anglo-Dutch War. He had some other things that was worth mentioning. He stopped banning Jews from entering the country because he believed that they could be converted and bring the rapture so much closer. Uh, and it continued on for quite some time. Uh, he left the Protectorate to his son, who was not up to the task, though, to be fair to him, whenever a choice was made to either honor his father's legacy or not, the people around Richard Cromwell would always choose to abandon Oliver Cromwell's legacy whenever possible. Cromwell's body was exhumed and destroyed, his head kicked around or left on display, and other things like that. Uh, there's there's many things to sort of talk about, but to finish up with his son knew when a cause was lost and traveled around Europe under self-exile. Charles II was brought back in, and quite a lot of the reforms that Oliver Cromwell brought in were abandoned as quickly as his reputation. But I will say that Charles II was never in any position like how his father was, and even though he did have his spats with Parliament, the specter of absolute monarchy completely abandoned England and would never return. The lessons of Oliver Cromwell's life are clear. It's that when one is given power, one should take it if one feels led to, either by personal ambition that you measure up to, or by the Spirit of God Himself. It's very clear that there are moments in Oliver Cromwell's life where he seems divinely inspired, where he wins battles, where he leads men into danger and brings them out unscathed, that protects him from the worst of what battle could offer. There's many opportunities here and there where he could have been killed, that he is simply not killed, where he could have been removed from power, where he keeps power. Uh, big moments include the trial of Charles I, and the gaps where he and Parliament have their disagreements. He attempts to care for the soul of his people, but quite frankly, his people do not accept it and do not appreciate it. When he dies, he's disrespected. Even though he dies as the Lord Protector of England, uh, it is clear that his legacy dies with him and his power dies with him. I view him as a great man and a Christian, but no saint, and I agree with some who say he was a brave, bad man. In the end, Cromwell shows that the legacies that we build for ourselves only last as long as God allows them to last. And while he kept power during his life everything he built and pursued crumbled away. Maybe that's the fault of him not accepting the kingship. Maybe it's the fault of the parliament for being fickle and the common men he had to rely on being fickle. And maybe it is simply the hand of God moving him where he needed, knowing that Cromwell would be faithful to him. For all of Cromwell's wrath and pride and hatred of the Irish, which, depends on how you view it, it is clear that something guides Cromwell from place to place, and that once Cromwell's uses are over, he is removed. And I think that is a harsh lesson for Christians to learn, especially as we seek to inculcate in ourselves, incubate the spirit of great men, to act in ways that are bigger and better than ourselves, to bring great works into being. As much as we would like ourselves to be, these great figures of history, with many, influences stretching decades into the future, we could also be people who show up, become a sort of tyrant, and then disappear as quickly for bigger and better things. For although Charles II was not very much, a good man or a great man or a saint or anything of that nature, he was certainly the rightful king of England, despite the crimes of his father. And it's certainly true that England would grow and prosper under his and others' reigns to the peak of the British Empire. But in that moment, Oliver Cromwell stopped an evil for the nation and set it up for that greatness by stabilizing the country, bringing the kingdom together, and even if it's in hatred of him, certainly cared for their spiritual well being, which I believe he deserves to be praised for, perhaps above even his military victories. You there, Anthony?
Sorry, I was muted for a second there. There we go. Okay. Uh, fantastic. I'm surprised you gloss over Ireland because as I just a quick Google, infogalactic search of Cromwell reveals much talk over his brutality in Ireland.
I
And they do speak of it as a brutality.
It's true. He was quite brutal. Let me see here. Here's the something. Uh, First off, I view this as a history written by those who hate on great men. But also, here's what Winston Churchill said. Upon all of these, Cromwell's record was a lasting bane by an uncompleted process of terror, by an iniquitous land settlement, by the virtual prescription of the Catholic religion, by the bloody deeds already described. He cut new gulfs between the nations and the creeds. Hell or Connaught were the terms he thrust upon the native inhabitants, and they, for their part, across 300 years, have used the keenest expression of hatred. The curse of Cromwell on you, upon all of us, there still lies the curse of Cromwell. So here's the thing. I am not a big fan of Winston Churchill, and I'm not a big fan of him because he gave up the empire. It is very clear that even though America was in ascendancy, things like the removal of India from the crown of the British Empire was not something supported by either the people or by the people of England or the people of India or, quite frankly, anyone else who should have been asked. It was instead frittered away under the guise of Gandhi and fairness and all the things that we ourselves groan under for it. And Winston Churchill does not come off very well from that. Even though he does have moments of heroism against the Nazis, he does not have moments of heroism in preserving the nation that he was given. It ended smaller than when he started, and for no reason that mattered. And no one can say that India was better off now than under the British Empire, at least spiritually, or even, quite frankly, in wealth. Having some tech companies and some billionaires does not a working nation make. Here's what Cromwell says about Ireland. I shall not, where I have power, suffer the exercise of mass. As for the people, what thoughts they have in matter of religion in their own breasts I cannot reach, but I shall think it my duty, if they walk honestly and peaceably, not to cause them in the least to suffer the same. Uh, he also said our private soldiers shall live peaceably and honestly at their several homes. They shall be permitted to do so. So to do, excuse me. Uh, while I haven't looked too deeply into Cromwell's opinions on Ireland, I am quite frankly unimpressed by Ireland, and I do not care for quite a bit of its so-called importance. Um, I think that the emotional damage he did to Ireland is not nearly as important as what he did to throw down the tyrant Charles I, and not as important as he did to preserve England's soul, or at least attempt to do so in the name of God.
Yeah, as I look into it, I will say that it does appear that there is debate over how bad he was to Ireland. Because here's the thing, I'm not looking at it in the context of like, oh, how important was Ireland or not important. It's like there are certain things that you cannot do, you know, and the Irish were not, whatever you could say about the Irish, as impressive or unimpressive they are, there is a major difference between them and, say, the Aztecs. Uh, with that said, it does seem to be a little bit less clear cut than, Cromwell was a butcher, Cromwell wasn't a butcher. There probably is an answer, but I haven't researched enough to give it. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I wish I had more of an opinion about this, but I'm going off of a lot of what you're telling me about the historical situation, and while I am sure that you are correct,
Am
I
I? I'm as much a
I just
propagandist as anything else.
I just don't know all of that much about this era of English history. Uh,
There's a while he did did commit some massacres and stuff like that. A little ethnic cleansing among friends. Uh, a lot of it was also done under Henry Ireton, who I believe was a son-in-law. Uh, and it's one of those things where, while the damage is real, and many probably Christian men and families were murdered, at least by starvation, if not directly. Um, I have never been able to summon up 1 ounce of care for it. Uh, like I'm seeing this stuff. Like let's take it to the modern world. Uh, right now we're seeing the Irish riot, or at least they were rioting, because of I believe it was some murders and a rape. Uh, but quite frankly, they still have a non-Irishman in control of their parliament as their whatever the equivalent of their prime minister is. They have not organized themselves into the IRA and begun their bloody work. Um, Instead, it's just some Irish things, and then the prime minister equivalent goes, "We must be able to arrest people who say racist things," and then essentially, it's anyone who criticizes migration. It's anyone who criticizes him or Indians. It's anyone who criticizes anything that they can get away with. It's an absolutely tyrannical law, and the fact is that they're well past the time that laws can save them. I will remind everyone of the quote of Pompey that I was sort of going to finish the life with Cromwell with, but I will say it now. Do not quote laws to us who carry swords. Whatever your opinion is on the lives and deaths of the people around them, the Aztecs had the swords against the people around them. Cromwell had his sword against the Catholics of Ireland, as well as um, the royalists. But quite frankly, I don't see any difference between that and what was done with the Huguenots. I don't see any difference between that and what was done in either Bavaria, Bohemia, or Wallachia and other places. And by the way, the reason why I'm not saying what side massacred what side in those and Austrian provinces, Romanian, is because it doesn't matter who was massacring who. It was, like one side was one and the other side was the other. Uh, Cromwell persecuted Catholics. Louis 15th allowed the Huguenots to be 14th. He allowed the Protestant Huguenots to be massacred. In some places, massacres went both ways. You look up to the defenestrations of Prague. As like the only ecumenical answer I can come up with without taking a side, and quite frankly, if you do not choose ecumenism, you must take a side, is that yeah, we killed each other. We killed each other a lot. In some countries, it was the Catholics who got massacred. In some countries, it was the Protestants who got massacred. What are we to do about it? Do you wish to bring up the massacre of the Irish? I've seen some Facebook posts, people talking about that. Okay, well, what about the Huguenots? They literally
Yeah,
they
don't get
started.
me wrong. I would not bring it up in terms of like let's assign historical blame. Like let's play that sort of historical blame game or something like
Yes,
that, which is a completely pointless thing to do. However, I don't think that you could completely ignore it when you're discussing a legacy. Is my
sure.
thought. At least that's my thought process. Right.
Yes.
With that said, like I said, I'm not even criticizing what you're saying here because as
Mhm.
I look into it, it's like there does seem to be, there's a whole section that's like debate over Cromwell's effect on Ireland. What did, how much of an effect and what exactly did Cromwell do is
Mm.
debated.
Yes.
So like I don't know, I don't think that was the main part of Cromwell's legacy. But
No.
it's also like if we're going to discuss him as a good Christian man, it's like okay, but there's a good Christian man who may have massacred fellow Christians.
Sure.
Like, well, only maybe.
Well, it's like, or at least allowed it. We'll say allowed. But
Hmm.
also I would say, depending on your opinion about Habsburgs, they allowed the massacre of Protestants. They encouraged them, quite frankly, and they encouraged them in a much more direct way.
I mean, I don't really have an opinion on Habsburgs. I think that it depends on the individual Habsburg. For example,
No, 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 hold on.
well,
But what I'm saying is that like it's it to me it's a never-ending pit. Like he conquered the Irish,
oh, I see what you mean.
uh,
Yeah.
and oppressed them and caused them ruination. And he was religiously motivated because, uh, quite frankly, certain ideas of Catholicism are antithetical to Protestantism, and there's no bridge to that gap. Even though I don't fight on the Eucharist, there is certain things that I will not admit to, especially when it considers whether or not Christ has is still in a state of suffering, uh, as well as certain ideas uh, of how our salvation works in accordance to things like taking in the mass, confession, and whatnot. There are bridges that simply cannot be gapped, and in a time of religious war, there's only a few hammers running around that are any sort of value. It is both Protestant and Catholic precedent to massacre the other side that won't convert. Henry VIII killed many Catholics and probably many good Catholics as well. And he certainly killed some of his Protestants too because he was a tyrant. But at the same time, when I look through, the state of things, England accepted Protestantism much more peaceably than other nations. Even with death tolls like what Cromwell and his son-in-law did to the Irish, it simply does not compare to some of the things like with the Huguenots and with the German Peasants' War and other things like that. Um, the cycles of oppression and massacre were still going on. And if let me just double check when the Huguenots stopped being a thing. Um, if I recall, uh, they were still fighting during this period. Started in the 1530s, and where are they? And continued to the 1760s. Uh, though, quite frankly, they sort of just disappeared into the world. Uh, let's see, where is. There we go. They still had things like the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre, even in the memory of some living people, even though they would have been children. And the massacres didn't really stop for quite some time. They just weren't as famous and they weren't as massive. They scattered out into the world. So you would have people traveling through England and other places that were, Huguenot stock. The idea that we can sort of go through things and go, bog ourselves down with religious wars has never been appealing to me in the character of a man. In the end, the character of Cromwell is religiously motivated and violent. Whenever he is given something, he tears into it and holds on to it with everything he has because he believes that God has given it to him. And with the successes that he has, somebody's certainly giving it to him, and we know that God allows those who rule over the nations. One of the reasons, and I didn't really intend to go into this, but I'll say it, that Christian nationalism never really appeals to me is because I know that in God's hand is the heart of the king. God allowed Charles I to be killed. He allowed him to be executed. Charles I made his own decisions, and in the end, when it came time to prove whether or not God would bless him, he was not blessed. Instead, Oliver Cromwell was blessed. Oliver Cromwell was given power over England, and Oliver Cromwell did his best. I believe that the lesson here isn't some sort of, um, must massacre Irish to be a good man. Though I'm sure there are some who can get behind that. But it's rather that when you're given a task, that you must see it through with almost religious fervor, and in fact, religious fervor in many regards. Uh, God has set you in a certain time, in a certain place, and is moving you throughout history. We're given things to do, and we must do them. Even horrible jobs. Like I'm in a pretty bad job right now, and I've got issues, and they might screw me out of some money and other things like that I could claim. But I'm still put there, and I'll be there until I'm taking out of it. And since I'm working for Christians, uh, the rules that apply to them are harsher than those that are applied to the world. If we look at these things that Cromwell experienced, that Cromwell did, it is clear to me that Cromwell is not some villain of history, much like people would like to make Hernan Cortés out to be. But rather, he is a man who was given tasks to do, and he did them. He didn't do them in as flashy a manner as Cortés or other great men of history that we've mentioned, but he did it with a tenacity that cannot be underestimated. Even as Hernan Cortés fought for, every inch of Aztec ground in gold, and as he, freed the Indians around him and other things like that, whether that for good or ill, whether for murder and gold and greed and pride, or whether for genuine religious devotion. Um, I do not believe that there is much of a separation between these two men as might be expected. In fact, I'd say the biggest difference between them is that Oliver Cromwell's mind is much more turned to spiritual matters explicitly in his letters and desires, as much as Hernan Cortez was, shall we say, a much more lusty gentleman. Uh, I don't. I have never come across any accusations of infidelity on Cromwell's part. And it's very clear that whenever Cromwell is given opportunities to do things like become king, that he refuses. As even though he does, tenaciously grab onto every opportunity, in the end, he still understands his place in the cosmos, and his place was not king. It was as a servant of God.
I see. I mean, in terms of like, can you classify him as a great man? I think that the answer is a very clear yes,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like, in terms of impact on history and the things he was able to accomplish in his life, which is more or less how I classify it. It's kind of an
Yes.
ephemeral phrase,
Yes.
right? Like, there's no exact definition here. Uh, but I would, yeah, I think that you could certainly, you certainly can make the case of Cromwell as a great man based on my knowledge of him, which is admittedly somewhat, like I said, somewhat limited. But yeah, no, I don't really have much. I don't really have much else to say except that
How would
my
you?
yeah. Go ahead, ask
How,
your question. Actually,
how would you compare and contrast the man based on what you've learned today? Both Hernan Cortez and Cromwell, much like I just did.
so how would I can? Yeah, that's actually what I was about to do. So we're on the same page here, more or less. Uh, I guess what I would say is between the two men, I think that Cortez was the overall more competent of the two. In the sense of Cortez was a man who had extraordinary natural gifts and advantages, right? Everybody tries to put things into a binary. You actually see it with the recent thing with Napoleon. Now, I literally have no idea what to make of this movie because I've seen nobody comment on it except to meme it. Uh, and I cannot tell if it's good, bad, or something in between. Uh, because literally the only things I've seen are people making jokes about it, and that doesn't tell me anything practical, right? So, but you see it with the commentary surrounding Napoleon. Napoleon is either somebody who started from nothing and then became a huge hero, or he was somebody who had all of these advantages and became a huge hero. In reality, neither of these things is true, because history isn't that simple. Napoleon did not start from nothing. Napoleon started with some advantages, but not every advantage in the world. He started like many people. You know, Cortés was the same way. Cortés, it's not quite fair to say that Cortés started from nothing. He had a noble title. Uh, Cortés had his advantages. But he certainly did not start as part of the upper echelon of society. That much is clear. So, in terms of, yeah, in terms of the comparison between the two, Cromwell was certainly more explicitly motivated by religion, though I would still contend that Cortés was not entirely unmotivated by it. Uh, and in terms of like how the two acted among each other, like, what can we say about, for example, Cromwell's attacks against the Irish versus things that Cortés did? Uh, well, I'm not really sure if you could say anything at all. To be honest, like with Cortés, yeah, it's hard because the Aztecs were different from the Irish, but how much did this really matter to, I guess, the Spanish? Like, were the Spanish really that concerned with the fact that the Aztecs were such an abjectly evil society? Some of them were, certainly. There's no question of that. That some of them were very concerned with how evil the Aztecs were. But a lot of them just wanted gold. Where did Cortez fall on the scale? To be honest, we don't really know. Like, we genuinely don't. And I guess that's where I would end it. History, I guess, would be better if it were just a little bit neater.
It's true. I think I don't believe Cromwell was. I'm sorry, Cortez was much of a letter writer or a diarist because I've never heard of him having them. Um, maybe he
No, he
was.
wrote to the king. He wrote to the king, and he
Oh,
wrote normally to defend himself.
gotcha.
Right? He would
Okay.
write to the king asking for men, and he would write very obsequiously because it was the king. Now, at this point in history, the king of Spain also happened to be the Holy Roman Emperor, and so he was quite powerful. Uh, like he had a role that was larger than just the Spanish crown. And to be frank, the king of Spain wasn't really that invested in trying to think how to put it. Like she she wasn't the king of Spain wasn't really that invested in America at the time, right? Like he sort of let America handle itself. He listened to what people were telling him, and then he just uh tried to he tried to manage it, let it manage itself as much as he could, right? So Cortez, for example, he's seeing all of this go down, and then he's hearing these reports of this man went rogue, but after he went rogue, he took over an entire empire in Mexico. So like, how do you even handle that? And then you're getting these two disputed letters. One of them is from Velasquez, who goes, "This man expressly disobeyed a direct order from me, and then when I sent men after him, he converted them to his cause in direct defiance of your authority." And then you have Cortez's side going, "Sure, I didn't listen to that dipshit, but like," he goes, "but I did it all for you." And the king is just kind of sitting there going, "I have no idea what to make of any of this." So Cortez constantly felt as if he never got the credit he deserved. And in
Hmm.
a sense, he was right, because the king was always like, they would award him, but they would always award him with caveats. But the caveats were always because, frankly, Cortez was a loose cannon and they were terrified of him. Like,
Yes.
you can't not reward him because he's just defeated an entire empire for you and
Right.
claimed it in the name of Spain, and he didn't. And to Cortez's credit, or I suppose if you want to say could have been an even greater man, perhaps shame, but I would say credit. I think it's a virtue. To Cortez's credit, he did not go rogue and like declare himself king of Mexico or anything like that.
Right.
But they were very much worried that that would happen. That's why when the king made him governor of Mexico, he also appointed like four like vice governors, which Cortez probably correctly interpreted as, "You want four watchdogs keeping an eye on me at all times." And he was probably right about this. And Velasquez was also like, I don't know, the best way I could describe Velasquez is he was constantly needling Cortez, right? Like,
Right.
if he was going to go on this trip, well, then he had to go with him, and he wasn't going to give him the men he wanted, and he wasn't going to give him anything, right? And Cortez kept having to battle with him for the men that he needed. Uh, I think that story, as great as the quote is, where he goes like, "So who are you?" And he's like, "I'm the man who won you more protectorates, more protectorates than your ancestors won you series or won you cities." And that's a fantastic quote, right? 10 of 10. Great men
Yep.
deserve
Yep.
get these great quotes. It's also pretty sad though, right? Like if you think about it for a moment, it's a pretty sad quote because what it shows is that at this point in Cortez's life, the current king of Spain, who I think was a new king at the time, but the current king of Spain like had forgotten about Cortez. And this happened, like, imagine that within his lifetime he had been forgotten about. Like, that's just crazy to me. Like,
Yep.
imagine that.
Yeah. No, it's like it's we're at 8 o'clock, so I'm gonna sort of push
Yep.
us towards ending this. But it's like it's similar to me with Cromwell. Like the second that they could, they basically said, we're not doing this thing. We want Charles II back. We want kings again, and there's something to be said for that. But at the same time, Richard Cromwell self-exiled, and he was sitting and eating with what was he, the Prince of Conti, and he observes, uh, and the Prince of Conti observes, well, that Oliver, though he was a traitor and a villain, was a brave man, had great parts, great courage, and was worthy to command. But that Richard, that coxcomb and poltroon, was surely the basest fellow alive. What has become of that fool? Not knowing that Richard Cromwell was sitting at dinner in attendance with him, uh, Cromwell replied, Richard Cromwell, he was betrayed by those he most trusted and who had been most obliged by his father. Uh, and then he says that he just kind of went away the
Yeah.
following morning. And there's a similar theme with both these men. These men rose from lower to middle class homes. They had opportunities and took them. They had spiritual nature to their lives, and when it came to military conflicts, they were vigorous in their attacks, and they did not stop. Both, in the end, received some of what they wanted, but they never succeeded truly in what they wanted to succeed at. Hernan Cortés never received the glory in his life that he wanted, and he died in debt. Oliver Cromwell never received the spiritual revival he wanted, and the second he died, it all started unraveling. And even though his son did his best, I believe, he was not the man his father was, and many men forget their oaths to dead men. So that both of them, while Cromwell died in a better state than Hernan Cortez, both of them never quite got what they wanted, either in life or death, to the fullness
Yeah,
of their
I guess
expectation.
that's the last thing I'll say. It's similar to me. Uh, there's something similar to the lesson of Hannibal, although it's not quite as extreme. Because my takeaway from Hannibal was that Hannibal was a man I admire tremendously. He strikes me as a man born to the wrong people in the wrong time, in a sense, right? Like he was too good for the people around him, and they did not appreciate him, and he could never, he wasn't able to accomplish all that he could or should have been able to accomplish if he were with a better people. Cortez, it's not quite as depressing of a story as Hannibal. For one thing, in the one major enterprise of his life, the conquest of the Aztecs, he succeeded in spectacularly. Uh,
Yes.
but there is a similar moral here, and also, by the way, which is very differently from Hannibal, he seemed to be genuinely concerned for the souls of the people who he was in charge of, to the point where he took a personal interest in making sure that they got good spiritual care. And
Yes.
that's something that we can hope that the Lord looks kindly upon him at the end of his life. I won't speak to the state of his soul, but but we can pray that the Lord looked kindly upon him for that. Uh, and we should, as
Mm.
we should for all people, and then we should pray for Cromwell as well. In all seriousness, uh,
Yes.
but in all of that, I look at Cortez as a sort of cautionary tale, because this was a man who accomplished one of the all-time great. Uh, he did one of the greatest things that's ever been accomplished by a single human ever. He led the expedition that took out a massive, mighty empire, a vicious, cruel people, outnumbered, uh, outgunned, with little to no support. He had to win this. Like you could say, oh, but he did get support. No, he had to convince people, right? He
Mm.
had to talk them into supporting him. He went in with no support. He had no one backing him up. Through sheer charisma, he turned all of this around and ended the reign of one of the bloodiest and most evil peoples ever to walk the face of the earth. And despite this, despite this, by the time he died forgotten and in debt. And I think that's the lesson that we should take. The things that are valued by the world, and the things that are valued by God, and the things that are truly important are all different things. If God is going to be kind to Cortés, it will not be because he conquered the Aztecs. As evil as the Aztecs are, that will not be the reason God looks kindly upon him. If God looks kindly upon him, it will be because somewhere in Cortés's soul, he truly wanted to do right by the Lord. And that's where he has to hang his hope. He was depressed that the world did not recognize him. Well, the world, and today, the world now tries to slander him, which is worse, right?
Yes.
He's slandered as some sort of bloodthirsty, you know, as some sort of bloodthirsty warrior, which he absolutely was not. He was many things, but bloodthirsty is not a phrase I think applies to Cortés. I think that the lesson that we need to take from people like Cortés is that our goal is not to be great men. Our goal is to be saints. And while the two line up with each other, there is overlap. They are not one to one, and
Right.
that's where I will end it.
Yes. I think while there is time to do well, if you look at people in the past like Joshua, he did do massacres, he did do fights. Joshua's heart was ever for the Lord. As for me and
Mm-hmm.
my house, we will serve the Lord. That's what he says. And I believe that the imperfect men that we're looking at here, uh, their themes, their ideas, do their greatness push them for a very clear signal that the Lord is what matters, nothing else. Thank you all for joining. I hope you'll join us next week. Well, we will do something else. Have a good one.
Woohoo!